Before we get started with our next panel, let's hear from today's sponsor, PepsiCo Frito-Lay.
If I was a flower grown wild and free, I'd want you to be my sweet honeybee. And if I was a tree grown tall and green, I'd want you to shade me, be my leaf. If you were a river in the mountains tall, the rumble of the water would be. If you were the winter, I'd know I'd be the snow, just as long as you were with me when the cold winds blow. If you were awake, I'd be a nod. If you were a seed, well, I'd be a pod. If you were a floor, I'd want to be a rug. And if you were a kiss, I know I'd be a hug.
Thank you. Now we will shift our focus a bit to Capitol Hill and the legislative landscape. In this panel, we're going to discuss the tax issues that face agriculture and face Congress this year. It's safe to say that the Tax Cut and Jobs Act and tax policy is at the very top of the to-do list for Congress this year. And we're going to talk about why that is and what the prospects are for moving a very, very large tax bill. And just to set the landscape a bit, for those of you all, or probably most of you familiar with it, but the 2017 tax law that was enacted through the reconciliation process in December of 2017, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the individual provisions of that bill are set to expire after this year, and that's what Congress has to deal with. And we'll get into the details of that. But first, I want to introduce this distinguished panel. Starting to my left is Bill Hoagland, Senior Vice President of the Bipartisan Policy Center. Before that, Bill spent 33 years on Capitol Hill with the Congressional Budget Office and then with the Senate Budget Committee. There is no one who knows the budget process and the reconciliation process better than Bill. And to his right, to his left is Chuck Connor, very well known to everyone here, President and CEO of the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives. Caroline Harris, who's a partner with Capital Tax Partners. And finally, Joby Young, Executive Vice President of the American Farm Bureau Federation. Now, to start off with, I ask Joby, Chuck, and Caroline to talk about, kind of lay out for us what's at stake in the TCJA and these expiring provisions, and some of the provisions that may not have expired, but Congress is going to want to address with business investment and expensing provisions and so forth. So, Chuck, I wanted to start with you. I asked you to talk about just a minor issue, the pass-through deduction, pass-through business income deduction. As most of you know, most farmers are taxed on the individual tax returns through small businesses, and there was a provisions put in the TCJA in 2017 to try in part to equalize the individual and small business tax treatment with the corporate taxes. So if you could, Chuck, start off talking a little bit about what's at stake here for agriculture in terms of those elements of the TCJA.
Well, thank you, Phil. Let me just say what's at stake is a lot, folks. I think we've all read. This is depending on your estimate, a $4 to $5 trillion tax bill. Many provisions in here, impacting farming, ranching, and agribusiness in a very significant way. probably the most significant of all of those tax provisions is what Phil mentioned, the so-called 199A deduction. Those of you who were around in 2017 know that the bill was in real trouble until they felt like they got the right balance between corporate rates, which they wanted to cut, and the small business incentives, if you will. And they did that, and of course, it passed. The difference, of course, is that the corporate rate was permanent. A lot of the small business changes, including the 199A deduction, expire at the end of this year. So from our standpoint, the 199A deduction is huge. Let me just say that for all the producers, know that if the 199A deduction goes away, there is nothing else in this bill that can prevent farmers from paying higher taxes, period. So, there's no alternative. There's no, well, why don't we try this? No. Farmers will pay a higher tax rate unless this 199A deduction is preserved. The 199AG is a very specific fill co-op deduction where the co-op actually receives the deduction, our members, and they have the option. They can retain it or they can pass it through to the members. So this is a lot of flexibility for a member-owned, member-controlled business, and that's an important thing as well. But the key point here is that to maintain this balance between corporate and small business, you've really got to extend this 199A provision. And for us, there's other important provisions, but that's the one that just fundamentally is going to determine how much Uncle Sam is going to be dipping into the farmers' pockets over the next several years.
And Joby, talk about the estate tax. The TCGA doubled the estate tax exemption, right? Talk about that and its significance to your members.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thanks everybody for being here and have us and paying attention to this issue. I'll just back up real briefly first and just kind of talk about why it matters generally out in farm country, the whole bill. As I think most people know in the room, 95% of farm and ranches in this country are family businesses. 98% of those are organized as pass-throughs. So when you talk about these provisions, they're extremely important out here in farm country. If the provisions in TCJA were to expire, it's a $9.5 billion per year, as we have it, tax increase on farmers and ranchers. So those are big numbers in the aggregate. Why does it matter? Why do policymakers hopefully care about that? There's a bipartisan concern, as we know, about food security in farm country. I'm repeating things that everybody knows here, but just to make sure that they're said. A lot of pressures in costs, a lot of pressures in price. Of course, a big part of running a farm business and having a successful and vibrant rural community, but also the risk and uncertainty around it too. Those are two big factors, and so a lot of that bound up in this. It's not just a food security concern, a bipartisan concern with those rural communities, a bipartisan concerns with things like small and medium-sized farms. Farm Bureau, our delegate body that gets together and votes on our policy, 65% of those are small or medium-sized farms, and so a big concern for us. But these policymakers on both sides of the aisle are concerned about farmers and ranchers of those small and medium-sized makeups, and of course, and new and beginning farmers. And so when we talk about that $9.5 billion, when you break it down into what that means for an individual farm, Chuck was just talking about the 199A. Our numbers put it at about a $2,500 tax increase for an average farm out there. And so as we know, there's plenty of farms not making money. If you're just right across the line and being just a little bit profitable, that makes a big difference if you're one of those small and medium-sized farms and you have that average of $2,500. The marginal and marginal tax rates and the expanded tax brackets, that's a $2,200 tax increase. And so those are big numbers when you put them in the aggregate. On top of that, when you go to the estate tax, which is, as you might imagine, a big priority for us, of course, that's going to affect a smaller number of farms that make it into those levels, those cutoffs, the 11 million right now. But if it the TCJ expires, it goes down to about half of that. And so that's scooping up a lot more farms. And as we all know that farmers and ranchers out here, a lot of their net worth is bound up in land. And so as those land rates rise, they're carrying more and more share of their assets in the land, and it's putting them over these thresholds. So that higher threshold is extremely important to keep them out of that, because if they have to sell the land to pass to the next generation, that's leading to the fewer and fewer farms. We lose 77 a day right now. We don't want to put more fuel behind that, of course, and it leads to the consolidation, other things that we talk about a lot in this town. So those things are all important, and I think that, of course, in the last comment would be the uncertainty of just knowing what this is going to be in the temporary time frame is important as well.
Yeah, I'd like to come back and talk about the uncertainty as we get into this process that we're going to talk about in terms of what it's going to take to move this legislation. Caroline, I ask you we've talked about the individual provisions, the Section 199A, the pass-through deduction, some of these others, all individual have to do with tax rates too, also are lower under the TCJA. But they're also expensing investment of various things that are in play, or may, in some cases, they were extended by the TCJA beyond, maybe made permanent, but there's interest in expanding them. Could you talk a little bit about the investment and expensing provisions?
Sure. So a big part of the TCJA was changing cost recovery. So how quickly you can write off a capital asset, heavy equipment, things like that when you purchase it. A big provision in TCJA was full expensing, and we went from 2017 through the end of 2022, and you could write off 100% of that asset in the first year, which is always great because it puts cash back in your pocket. However, because of the revenue constraints that we faced during 2017 in reconciliation, same rodeo we're talking about today, that provision wound down. We could not afford to make that permanent. So in 2023, went to 80%, meaning you could write off 80% of that capital asset and you would have to depreciate the remaining 20%. Goes down 20% every year. Meaning in 2025, you can write off 40% of that asset and you have to depreciate the remaining 60% over a longer period of time. And eventually in 2027, there will be no expensing if Congress does not act and address this. So obviously that's a big deal. There is another provision that is used by smaller businesses, and the reason it's used by smaller businesses, it's capped. So you can write off $1.25 million, I believe is the inflation adjusted amount, as a small business of capital investments. But once you hit capital asset purchases of just a little over $3 million, you start seeing the dollar amount that you can write off under that provision decrease. And the reason is that they really want this to be a small business provision. So they want to cap it in that way, and that also keeps the costs down. There are a lot of decisions that go into whether you pick to do full expensing and use that provision or use this smaller provision. On the bonus depreciation, larger expensing provision, it is available for both new and used assets, which is not the case with the smaller provision. You also can generate net operating losses using the larger provision, but not the smaller one. So it really just depends on your personal situation and how large you are. But cost recovery, obviously anything that puts your money back in your pocket is a good thing. And so I think we're looking to address that in this year. I will also add that in 2017, about a quarter of the growth impact was driven by the full expensing provision. So it's not only great for taxpayers to put money in their back pocket, but it also helps contribute to growth. So I'll stop there, Phil.
Okay, all right, thanks. Now, Bill, you're not getting away. When is this going to pass? Let's talk about what it's going to take to get there.
Well, it's always the right thing to put the budget guy at the end of a conversation and at the beginning, because he always will be a Debbie Downer, and I'm probably not going to surprise you in that sense. Of the things we just discussed, the lower the individual tax rates, farmers definitely need that. Pass-throughs, 199A. Bonus depreciation, estate tax, just those four things add up to about $3.5 trillion. That doesn't even come close to all the other things that the president wants, like lowering corporate tax rates, not taxing Social Security tips, and just last Thursday putting on the table not taxing anybody with incomes below 150,000. I don't know how you do this. All of you understand, and this is the process part. You understand that the reason we're going through this is to avoid a 60-vote hurdle in the United States Senate. And the only way you can do that with the margins as small as they are is to adopt a budget resolution conference agreement. We are nowhere near that today. There is a big difference between the Senate and the House on the budget resolution conference agreement. I understand the Speaker says we're going to have all this done by Memorial Day. Chalk me up as skeptical. Largely because even if we could get a budget agreement between the House and Senate that sets up the reconciliation process. The last time I worked on I won't say that. Let's put it this way. There are 11 committees in the House and Senate that have been reconciled to achieve savings. And if we go back to the Inflation Reduction Act, the budget resolution that was agreed to that set up the Inflation Reduction Act was adopted in August of 21. It wasn't until August of 22 before we actually got to that point. Finally, let me just, I hate to do this, but here's the budget resolution out of the House. And there's a provision in here. It says, I apologize, I'm going to read it to you. It is the goal of this current resolution to reduce mandatory spending $2 trillion over the budget window. If the combined deficit reduction provided by authorizing committees is below that target, it is the policy of the Committee on the Budget of the House that the instruction provided to the Ways and Means Committee, the tax cut, will be reduced by a commensurate amount below the $2 trillion. Tell me, we are in for a real Donnybrook here, I guess on St. Patty's Day, it's appropriate, to deal with what's coming up. I remain very skeptical that we're going to get all this done, and I guess I'm going to argue, and I'll leave it to the tax experts here, I think we're looking at some form of a continuing of the current tax bill into next year, if not into 2 years from now. Sorry.
So a short-term extension is what
Wouldn't be bad, I guess,
predicted.
for these programs. An extension of these existing provisions wouldn't be the worst thing that happened. But I'm not even sure we're going to get a budget resolution anytime soon, to my point, and it's going to take quite a bit of time to actually fill out the gaps for the 11 committees that have been reconciled. And let's be clear, this is tied up with the spending cuts too. And when I add up the spending cuts, and the big one, you hear it every day, and I just was on another panel this morning, Medicaid, that makes up nearly $900 billion of the offset. If anybody's been following the news, even in my home state and Chuck's home state of Indiana, red state, there's some nervousness about reducing Medicaid. Now, waste, fraud, and abuse, absolutely. But I'll tell you right now, it's very difficult to reconcile waste, fraud, and abuse in a legislative process.
Well, let's drill down on some of those issues you've raised, Bill. Starting with, I want to get your reaction, the rest of the panel's reaction to that idea that we could just have a short-term extension. I assume you're talking about a year or two just to get it past this year. Or what? If you're skeptical it's going to be that long. Chuck, starting with you, what's the problem with that? What's your reaction, your gut reaction to that?
I'm glad to see my colleague from Indiana is no more optimistic now than he was when he was in the Senate Budget Committee and would send us all these nasty ag instructions.
By the way, we both are Purdue graduates, so we're not too optimistic about Purdue this year either. So.
We're just kind of down. But Phil, let me just say, I haven't analyzed the 1 year sort of thing at all, but I will just tell you, I don't I wouldn't challenge anything Bill has said in terms of the challenges of the process and what we have in front of us. However, no, this is a $4 to $5 trillion tax increase if Congress doesn't do anything. The Congress and the presidency are in the hands of Republicans. They know, and I believe strongly that they cannot begin to stand for reelection having sat on that kind of a tax increase. So by some mechanism, they will figure out a way to avert this, in my view. And I can't lay it out, Bill. It's going to be, it won't be pretty, but in my view, it will happen.
Be clear, when I say an extension, it's an extension of current policy. So I would argue that you could extend the current policy. You get everything that's in the current bill, you just extend it for a year. So there wouldn't be a tax increase. It would retain the existing bonus depreciation today, and the rates cuts too. But that was what I was.
Does 1-year extension get you anything in terms of then the midterm elections, which typically go against the party in control?
Right.
Caroline, from what do you tell?
From my
how do you
perspective?
advise
What do I advise?
clients?
I mean, look, I think, the problem with a 1 or 2 year extension, if that's all you can get, that's all you can get. We did that with the fiscal cliff, I think, in 2010, and then came around and readdressed that stuff. But the reality is good tax policy is good, and permanent good tax policy is great. So, I mean, the certainty factor is a huge issue. You guys don't sit here and wait till December 31st to figure out what you're doing the next year. Congress sort of does, though, and I think that creates challenges. That really, if we could get these things done and make some of these provisions permanent, would be significantly better. So I'm going to root for permanency and long-term, but acknowledge that Bill does, you bring up a good point about the reality of there's not agreement on a budget resolution, and that's like step 2 of a 7-step process to get this done. So there are real challenges out there.
Well, I mean, I would concur with that. I think that this is like a lot of other things we've been dealing with legislatively in recent times, is that we're just trying to find the least bad option at this point. And sometimes that's what you're doing. I mean, I'd reiterate from a farmer and rancher perspective, the same point Caroline made. There's, as you get further in the year, you're starting to make planning decisions and purchasing decisions and all these sorts of things. And so the speaker's goal is certainly a lot better than a December timeframe or whatever, because obviously those things are not being, made when you get that late in the year. And these are big numbers for a farm and ranch family out there. I mean, the biggest tax increase that's if it's not renewed that we see percentage-wise is in that band of the medium-sized farm, that sort of 150 to 400,000 a year range, and that's where you get most of the folks that are starting to have the lion's share of their income come from the farm business. And so when they're looking at a 20%, and they're the highest section for us, that's a 20% tax increase. That's a big chunk. And so as you get later in the year, that comes pretty tough when you're saying, all right, am I going to pay this level or this level up here?
I want to ask you and encourage you to get the questions are starting to come in, so get yours in on Slido, and we'll get to those in a second. We're going to get into talking about how do we pay for this tax bill. Do we have to pay for it? I guess that's the first question. Do you expect that there's going to have to be offset, and by how much, given what you're seeing coming out of Congress? There's obviously a lot of pressure from the House Freedom Caucus, members of the House Freedom Caucus anyway, to offset the cost of this. Chuck, you mentioned $4.5 trillion is roughly what we're talking about, the cost of extending over 10 years. And that's not any of the new provisions, like no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, and so forth that the president has proposed. Chuck, do you think are we going to have to offset this and some or all of it?
Phil, this is a wild guess on my part. My strong sense is at this point that this kind of current services baseline, if you will, that Senator Crapo has been really advocating as chairman of the Senate Finance Committee for a couple of years now, I think probably ends up prevailing in the overall scheme of things. In other words, if it's current tax policy, the assumption is, that that's the policy going forward versus, falling back to something pre-2017. So that's a strong instinct on my part. I do think to the extent that they want to do any of the president's additional items, my strong sense is those would have to be offset. But for everything under the TCJA that have, again, been the law of the land since 2017, I'm sensing they're going to go to some kind of a current services sort of baseline in that process, I guess.
Right, well, the current policy baseline, Bill, you don't have to offset it, but it still increases the deficit, right?
Absolutely.
So is the House,
Well, let me rephrase that. You don't have to offset it, but it will simply add $4 trillion to the deficit that we have right now.
and my question is, are conservatives in the House going to go for that?
You talked to Chip Roy. They have made a very strong case in the House that they should use what we call current law. Yes, the president met with the Republicans last Thursday from the Senate, and yes, there's a movement for current policy, which says just that we have these taxes that are in current policy today, and if we extend them, then that shouldn't require that they be offset. Be careful what you wish for, Republicans. Someday, maybe Democrats will be in control of the House and Senate, and they'll use that mechanism. So I think that I'm a budgeteer. I worry about the debt and deficits. I still think the agriculture sector, and being a farm boy from Indiana, I think it has a major impact on interest rates out there. So I would like to see if, listen, by the way, I'm all for extending the tax cuts. Don't get me wrong, but I'd like to see them offset. But I haven't seen any offsets up there to this day that comes anywhere near $4 trillion, and that's why Chuck is probably right. At the end of the day, they'll just ignore offsetting any of the $4 trillion extension.
Caroline, Joby, Caroline, can they get that through the House without the offsets? I mean, the Bill read the budget resolution in the House, and it was $1.72 trillion.
So I think one of the issues here with the current law, which the House wants to use, so under current law, if something expires at the end of this year, you have to pay if you want to reinstate it. Under current policy, we just assume it continues in perpetuity and we don't have to pay for it. I think one of the challenges with the current law baseline, outside of having to pay for things, is that it's extremely hard to make provisions permanent under that baseline, because you have to offset revenue losses in the out years, like after the 10-year budget window. We've heard the president and Majority Leader Thune and Chairman Crapo on the Senate side talk about we're only doing this if it's permanent. So I do tend to agree that we'll probably wind up with a current policy baseline. Will Chip Roy like that? Probably not. But, and look, the margins in the House are very thin. So I always say this, everyone can be king or queen for a day. Because if one person, causes a problem, then it really jeopardizes the entire effort in the House.
Hey, can I really get into the weeds for just a second here? The determination as to what baseline is being used, unfortunately, comes down to a decision, quite frankly, of one person, and that's the Senate parliamentarian. And if she says, as I think the law reads, that you have to use current law, if she says current law abides, then when that tax bill and that reconciliation bill is before the United States Senate, it loses its protection, privileged nature, and is fully debatable, fully amendable. It doesn't have the fast-track nature. So I don't know. I have a tremendous respect for the Senate parliamentarian. If it wasn't for her on January the 6th and getting those boxes off the floor, I don't know where we would be today. And I do believe that it puts a tremendous amount of pressure on the Senate parliamentarian. Now, she advises the chair. The chair could rule otherwise, but then we refer to it as a nuclear rogue ruling of the chair.
Well, I'm glad Bill got in the weeds there. I was about to make the exact same point, but I'm not a budgeteer, so I'm thankful that he is and Caroline is here. So, I mean, these are the hard things. I'd mentioned just a little bit more in my zone is just the easier part when we talk about the tax provisions. We do some survey work at Farm Bureau, and when we polled about just the public sentiment around some of these issues. The public out in the countryside, their opinions about lowering tax burdens on small businesses, not just farm ranchers, but all small businesses, tracks about the same. Republicans and Democrats have them right below 80%. When you talk about even something that we consider a little more controversial, like the state tax, I mean that's just a couple degrees below 80% in support. When you talk about what that actually means for a farmer and ranch, Taylor responded to that gets pretty high support. The deduction, the bonus depreciation, should farmers and ranchers be able to do those sorts of things? That's mid-80s. And so a lot of, bipartisan public support for these issues, and that makes it, hopefully, the numbers, of course, extremely difficult, no doubt there, but the politics of it, I think, are an easier piece of this whole debate.
Joby, are there spending cuts that, for example, that the House budget resolution require? Any of those that give you all pause? Chuck, I'd like to ask you the same question from your perspective, looking at your experience in rural and ag policy. Are there any of those possible spending cuts that would be concerning?
Well, I don't know if Chuck's got an observation here. I'd have to actually look at it to see exactly what was written there. But of course, we'd look at that, and of course, have an opinion about those things as well. But I don't know if Chuck has a specific one on his mind.
Well, obviously, Phil, as you know, the differences between the House and the Senate budget resolution is very different. Two different resolutions. The ag provisions are extremely different, with the Senate all but taking a pass on cuts, and the House having some very healthy ones in place, $230 billion. So yeah, that's a big difference to work out. Part of that, I think, Phil, is why I think at the end of the day they are. I don't want to say it quite this way, but if you've got tax rates and you're weighing taxes, $4 trillion in taxes, massive spending cuts, or higher deficits, I think I kind of know where Congress is going to come down on that. And again, I can't explain how all that sorts out, and I don't think they can they can't be too cute in this process. There's got to be a serious debate about spending, and it should be. But, at the end of the day, I think we're maybe putting a little too much emphasis on looking at how is this going to happen, and just fundamentally look at what can't happen here. And what can't happen is nothing, and a $4 trillion tax increase.
Okay. Let's talk a little about tariffs. The president obviously has talked many times, going back to the campaign, about using tariff revenue to offset these tax cuts. He's even gone so far as to talk about it eventually replacing the income tax. But setting that aside, first of all, Bill, do you have any sense of how much, one of our questioner here is, how much revenue would it take? You obviously talk about but realistically, how much revenue could you get from tariffs? Because you're not going to get $4.5 trillion.
I'm not a tariff guy, but let's. That's why I'm answering the question. Okay. So let me just make another. I'm sorry, guys. I have to go process here. The only way we can score the tariffs against offsetting the tax cut is if Congress acts to do those tariffs. As it stands right now, under the laws that have been put in place over many years, Congress doesn't want to set tariffs. They want the president to set tariffs, for good reason. So all I'm telling you is it's very difficult to offset $4 trillion in Congress with tariffs, because they don't want to be responsible for it. Now, should the president issue its tariffs he's talking about? I think any tariffs that he issues, whether it's the reciprocal or otherwise, comes nowhere near $4 trillion. And more importantly, from a person who believes we should budget with some sort of consistency, on again, off again, maybe, yes, no, tariffs, makes it impossible to be able to actually make realistic estimates of tariffs for offsetting what Congress is doing.
Is tariffs, the idea of using tariffs as offsetting revenue, whether it's informal, while the president saying, or formal through the CBO scoring, which Bill is saying they can't do unless Congress enacts it?
I would not, again, maybe at the end of the day, as Chuck says, it has to get done. They may say, okay, we're going to give credit to offset these tax cuts because the president's taken this action. But the permanency of those tariffs is just so uncertain, I wouldn't want to say that really offsets $4 trillion.
So it wouldn't be a CBO scoring, it would be an informal,
It'd be informal.
yeah, way for members to justify voting for a deficit increase. In other words.
Right.
Yeah. Does the idea of counting on tariffs for a tax bill, does that concern any of y'all?
Well, I mean, I'll just say, I
concept.
100% agree with Bill. You can't, the last time Congress enacted a tariff was in the 1930s. Congress is not going to enact a tariff, and therefore the tariff revenue is not, under the rules we operate in, going to count to offset the cost of extending these tax cuts. We've done stuff before. In 2017, we had folks look at how much growth it drives, and to make people feel better about how much they were adding to the deficit, we went around with this sort of unofficial score of growth and things like that, and helped appease some of the true fiscal conservatives, the Bob Corkers of the world, right? So could tariffs be used in that way again to sort of appease the Bob Corkers of the world this time? Sure, but it's not part of the official scoring process. And if you have confines set up by a budget resolution, those are the rules. So tariffs are a little too cute for this, I think.
I mean, the only thing I'd add, I mean, that these two know a whole lot more about the procedural aspects and have sharper pencils than me from economist framework to sort of figure out what the dollars and cents of that are. I mean, I think that we've talked generally about the tariffs and the Farm Bureau members' policy of not supporting tariffs and wanting to be very cautious about their use. Of course, because as we all know in this room, the ag sector, as history has shown, takes a lot of the retaliatory brunt when that happens. And so we've been clear about that, and we've tried to give that feedback. And I think as we've gone through the president proceeding to reach his goals, which our members support, security and fair trade and those sorts of things, just the duration of them and getting to that deal, and so that we can come out the other end of this and minimize the damage that will happen if the retaliatory piece continues.
I have a question that raises the question about increasing the deficit and the possible impact of that on the Federal Reserve and on interest rates. Should we be concerned about
Yes,
this
yes.
tax bill increasing interest rates?
Yes, keep in mind, guys, that our debt, by the way, you didn't want to get into this, I know, but we do have a statutory debt limit that we're going to hit sometime this spring. And by the way, that may become the leverage for resolving a lot of these issues we've talked about, long before we get a tax bill done. But no, my career has been spent worrying about debt and deficits. Listen, we're not going to balance the budget. Give me a break. But we can slow the rate of growth in our accumulating debt. And the thing that's concerning me today that I haven't really thought that much about in the past is you realize that about 35–40% of our debt is not funded by you and me and Americans. It's old Rudy Penner, a former CBO director. We're the best-looking horse in the glue factory. I'm not sure we're the best-looking horse in the glue factory today. And if that's stop getting that kind of buying of our debt internationally, what happens? We're going to have to raise interest rates. So I think that we have to be very careful about this. And yes, I think the Federal Reserve will react accordingly.
Interest rates, any of your members talk about, Joby, Chuck?
Of course, that's
That
going to
is
have
a
an
concern.
effect. The interest rates is going to have an effect in farm country. A lot of the risk that comes to bear on a farm business is credit risk amongst, weather risk and market risk and all the rest. So it's a part of that uncertainty. It's a part of the risk factor. So obviously, when you reduce that's good. But in a rising interest rate environment, that's going to affect the bottom line as well. So that would be a concern.
Okay. I have a question here about economic growth being the key determining factor in tax revenue estimates. There actually isn't is there any economic growth, Bill, from extending the current policy? That doesn't really
This is what
Use the
it's what
economy.
we refer to as dynamic scoring. And listen, there is growth associated. I think the bonus depreciation is a great idea. I think that creates growth. I think there are a number of other provisions in the tax code that create growth. But historically, we've never been able to fully offset the tax cuts, even the 2017 tax cuts, by offsetting it by growth. And so I'm coming off here awfully negative, and I'm sorry. I want the tax cuts to be, but I want them to be paid for. And, but I don't think just assuming or saying that there'll be all this economic growth, so we'll pay for $4 trillion over 10 years.
What about, we have a question about, of course, I think it's a reference to the DOGE cuts, cutting contracts, employees and buildings. I mean, how much we get from that? Is there any way that the rescissions of that funding get used to offset any of this?
You want to take that, Chuck?
Well, it's a good question. I'm kind of in Bill's camp a little bit that I think the debt ceiling extension might be a key factor in all of this in terms of, how we move forward on a number of these things. Look, at the end of the day, the DOGE cuts, if they succeeded in everything that they're trying to do, it wouldn't come close to touching the dollars that we need, to offset the taxes. But in political terms, there may be enough capital there, if you will, within the DOGE cuts and sort of reorganizing government, tightening the screws on government and the like, to generate, the support that they will need then to go forward with some of this other stuff to satisfy perhaps the Chip Roys of the world and people like that, if that's possible, kind of thing. So I see it being very important politically, far, far short economically to mean anything.
Only because I was in a different presentation this morning on a different issue, I made this calculation. The total civilian workforce, federal civilian workforce, is about 2 million people. By the way, that's about the same number that was during the Reagan administration. Salaries and expenses for that 2 million is about 6.7% of our total federal spending. If they were to reduce the federal workforce by 20%, you'd save $80 million a year. I'm all for getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. But it's a fraud, yes, but there's a reason it's called fraud. It's hard to identify and hard to find, and it's a criminal activity, and you have to go through a lot. I'm all for reducing waste and missed payments. But most of what's going on when the president, and I'm getting off the track here, but when they talk about all this fraud, it's not fraud, it's inaccurate payments. I presume even to the ag community, there are inaccurate payments out there, and they should be corrected, but that's not fraud.
Well, the question, I think, was about whether Well, of course, that's right. You want every program to be administered correctly, without fraud, without waste, without abuse. I mean, of course, absolutely. A lot of people in the room know I work with Secretary Perdue in the first Trump administration, and we came up to work every day. It was about effective, efficient, customer-focused administration of USDA's programs across the board, and we were trying to find all these things and maximize the value and the ease and the efficiency to the farmer, to all the other stakeholders that were out there. And so you want to be doing that, of course. To the question, I think that was as savings are realized. I mean, there's lawyers and others that at a place like USDA and budget officers that sort of advise about unspent funds and how those can be pulled back. I'm sure there's a lot of people on the Hill that are sharpening their pencils about, those sorts of things as they go into this. So I don't know the answers to that. Those are very complex things, of course, but I'm sure they're looking at it.
Bill, you brought up the debt limit, and that's we certainly need to address that, because that has been something that has been a red flag for some of the same Freedom Caucus members that like Chip Roy, that we've mentioned. How does the debt limit, if that gets tied into reconciliation bill, how does that affect the debate and the prospect of having to offset?
Yeah, my point here is that certainly you can, what we say, reconcile the debt limit and put it into a reconciliation. The point I'm trying to make here is we got a long way to go before we get to a reconciliation bill to be able to even reconcile, in which case it would avoid the 60 votes. We're going to hit, the organization I work for, the Bipartisan Policy Center, does something called the X date. The Congressional Budget Office will be putting out something in a few weeks. I can assure you right now, we're going to hit that X date before we get a tax bill through or a reconciliation bill through. So what I'm arguing, and if that's the case, then it will require 60 votes in the United States Senate to raise the debt. That's why it will become a leverage point for the negotiations going forward.
Carolyn, what's your read on that?
I think same thing. I mean, the reality is I think we're going to hit the debt ceiling probably sometime in around June, as we've kind of, and the ray of sunshine over here has mentioned, that, we've got a long way to go. We've got a long way to go. We're in like step 2 of a 7-step process. I mean, we're still arguing about budget resolutions. We haven't started talking about how you write a tax bill. I see a question here, where would we find $4 trillion in offsets? I mean, suggestions welcome. I mean, because that's the worst part of it, right? I mean, we have a tendency to rob Peter to pay Paul, and we do that in the tax code. We give somebody something over here, and we hike taxes over here. So I tend to agree with Bill, though. We're going to hit the debt ceiling well before we're going to get through this. I also think the House budget the House budget instruction right now the House budget resolution addresses the debt ceiling,
yes.
And the Senate basically does not. And I think the Senate's preference is perhaps to handle that outside of reconciliation.
Okay. We're getting short on time here, and I'm going to set everybody up. I'm going to come back to it. I want to talk about something else for a second, but I want to put each one of you on the spot with your prediction of when the new tax bill comes. So you have a couple of minutes to think about that. While we're on the subject of reconciliation, Chuck and Bill being the reconciliation expert, what are the prospects? We also need we're overdue now for a new farm bill. What are the prospects for provisions of the farm bill, say commodity program, reference price increases and some other things, a potential reduction in nutrition title? What are the prospects for that? Some of that winding up, since it's so hard to do a farm bill for a lot of the reasons that we're talking about, and particularly in the House. What are the prospects of some of that winding up in a reconciliation bill?
Well, Phil, let me answer it this way. I mean, I think many of our very difficult farm bills in the past, maybe many is not the right word, some of our difficult farm bills in the past have been done as a result of reconciliation. And so this is obviously in that category of very difficult farm bill. So is this reconciliation bill an option for that? Boy, you know, this Congress is, you know, demonstrating they are going to have a hard time doing a lot of legislative initiatives. I mean, they're you know, that's kind of the point, right? So in that regard, you know, just given how few bills are going to pass, you have to believe there's a chance that the Farm Bill and, you know, other priorities might be a part of that reconciliation process if they can get to that stage. You know, I think from the ag community standpoint, that's a big danger in doing that. I mean, we've got the basis for some very good farm legislation here. Our differences aren't as vast as they have been historically, in my humble opinion, and so I would like to see regular order proceed there. But, you know, realistically, just given Congress and their ability to not be able to get things done, you know, I think it's an option.
Well, I would just add to what Chuck said. Of course, we've historically and continue to hope for a bipartisan farm bill. I think the realities of a farm bill is that it's best done in a bipartisan way. That it makes the math, of course, from my observation, would be a little tricky with a reconciliation as it's sort of presented now, which is a much more sort of partisan framework. It's more Republican-led, and a lot of the elements of that seems to be would have opposite math to me. Now, I see a lot of smart folks that work in the Hill that we depend on to figure out those things, and I'm sure that they'll figure out the best way to do that. But that's a tough part for me when you think about the reconciliation part, both the practical exercise and then some of these long-term effects when we think about the fact that we have to continue to solve these problems years into the future, and it's always been best in a bipartisan way.
Okay. Bill, going to start with your prediction. How long is the tax bill how long is it going to be extended for, and when's it going to pass?
Sometime in the future.
Oh, Bill.
I think he's correct.
Chuck, come on.
2025. Sometime in 2025.
Yeah, you're going out on a limb too. Caroline, you come on.
I'll say I think this is a Q4 exercise. I think that Congress tends to, we don't tend to do things early in Washington. We tend to wait till we get to the precipice of the cliff and we're about to fall off, and that's when we address things. So I have no reason to believe this situation's any different. So I would say Q4 of this year is my guess.
Yeah, I would just have the observation that we've learned that these things are driven by whatever the hard deadline that we come up against. And so, whatever that ends up being here in the future, that would be my biggest prediction. I'm a little closer to Bill with the sometime in the future, I suppose. And if that's Bill's answer, then I wouldn't presume to have anything more detailed than that, given his knowledge on these issues. So.
Yeah, December 31st. All right. Well, thank you for that discussion. Before we head to our next panel, which will be moderated by Lydia Johnson, Associate Editor at Agri-Pulse, we'll now take a moment to hear from our sponsor, Edge Dairy Farmer Cooperative.
Welcome to Fisher Clark Dairy Farm. My name is Heidi Fisher, and along with my husband and his parents, we farm here and are preparing our farm for generations to come. And like so many dairy farmers, we're committed to producing high-quality milk while caring for our cows, our land, and our community. Being a part of Edge Dairy Farmer Cooperative gives us the ability to do more than just farm. It gives us a voice. We're a diverse group of farmers, big and small, working together to make sure our needs are represented, whether that's in Congress, with our customers, or in our communities. Farming today is challenging. Markets are unpredictable. Regulations are constantly changing, and we have to adapt. What I love about Edge is that it helps us navigate those challenges. We focus on real solutions, advocating for fair policies, expanding market opportunities, and making sure dairy farmers can keep doing what we do best. One of the biggest strengths of Edge is our collaborative approach. We work together to find ways to improve our industry, whether it's through policy advocacy, sustainability initiatives, or helping farmers connect with their processors.
Edge Dairy Farmer Cooperative works really hard on federal policy issues, from milk marketing order reform to farm bill issues, and we really look to be an advocate for our members. Also, we work with the Dairy Business Association and Minnesota Milk to work on state policy issues, but almost most importantly is working on sustainability efforts, aligning our farms with opportunities in the marketplace through their processors.
At the end of the day, dairy farming is about family, about community, and about leaving things better for the next generation. And Edge is helping to make that possible. If you're a dairy farmer looking for a strong, independent voice, Edge is here for you.